The restaurant fell completely silent when the billionaire laughed in the waiter's face. Around them, crystal glasses stopped halfway to lips, silverware froze above expensive plates, and every conversation died beneath the soft golden light of the afternoon dining room. The waiter stood there in a faded white shirt, his hands trembling slightly, his shoes worn from years of standing, but his eyes were steady. He had already been humiliated in front of everyone. Yet instead of lowering his head, he looked directly at the richest man in the room and quietly said, "Mock me again. I dare you." What happened next would change both their lives forever. Before we continue, if you believe that kindness can give people a second chance and that someone's circumstances never define their worth, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Epic Story Hub. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories like this to you. The story began on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at the Golden Meridian, one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. Sunlight poured through enormous glass windows, reflecting across polished tables and making the entire place glow like a palace. Wealthy businessmen discussed investments over imported coffee, executives checked their watches between meetings, and families celebrated birthdays beneath chandeliers that cost more than most houses. Moving quietly between them was a 34-year-old waiter named Marlon Reeves. He was not supposed to stand out. He had learned that people like him were expected to become invisible when serving people like them. Marlon had been working at the restaurant for nearly 3 years. Every morning, before coming to work, he prepared breakfast for his 8-year-old daughter, Sienna, packed her lunch, walked her to school, and then rushed across town to begin his shift. His wife had died unexpectedly 4 years earlier, leaving Marlon with a grief he never had time to fully process. Since then, he had become both father and mother to Sienna. He measured success differently from other men. Success was making sure there was food on the table. Success was keeping the electricity connected. Success was seeing Sienna smile when she opened her lunchbox. And every night, when she fell asleep, Marlon quietly promised her that someday life would become easier. That Tuesday, however, life seemed determined to test him again. At around 1 in the afternoon, the restaurant manager hurried toward the staff entrance and told everyone that a very important guest had arrived. His name was Cashin Vale, a billionaire investor whose companies controlled hotels, technology firms, and several luxury properties across the country. The manager warned the staff that everything had to be perfect. Cashin was famous for being demanding, impatient, and brutally honest. Nobody wanted to make a mistake around him. Marlon was assigned to his table. When he approached, Cashin barely looked up from his phone. He was a tall man in his early 50s, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit. His expensive watch rested loosely around his wrist, and his expression carried the confidence of someone who had spent decades being obeyed. Sitting across from him was his business partner, Gideon Rusk, who seemed to laugh at almost everything Cashin said. Marlon placed the menu on the table and politely explained the afternoon specials. Cashin finally looked up and noticed Marlon's worn shoes. His eyes traveled from the shoes to the faded cuff of Marlon's shirt. Then he smiled. It was not a friendly smile. He asked Marlon whether the restaurant had started hiring people who looked like they had just walked in from a bus station. Gideon laughed. A few nearby customers glanced over and then quickly looked away. Marlon felt the familiar sting of humiliation, but he swallowed it. He had bills to pay. He had a daughter waiting for him after school. Pride could not buy groceries. He simply told Cashin that he was there to serve him and asked what he would like to order. Cashin continued. He asked whether Marlon had ever imagined becoming something more than a waiter. Perhaps, he joked, he could someday become a manager of a restaurant if he learned how to polish shoes properly. Gideon laughed even harder. Marlon remained silent. But then Cashin noticed a small photograph tucked inside Marlon's wallet, visible for only a second when he reached for his notepad. It showed Sienna smiling in a school uniform. Cashin asked if that was his child. Marlon nodded. Cashin laughed again and said that children must have expensive dreams these days, especially when their father spent his life carrying plates for rich people. He suggested that Marlon should teach his daughter not to dream too high. That sentence hit differently. Marlon could tolerate insults against himself. He had learned to. But the moment someone mocked his daughter's dreams, something inside him changed. He placed the notepad gently on the table. The entire restaurant seemed to quiet around them. Marlon looked Cashin directly in the eyes and said that maybe he was right about one thing: people like him did not have much money. But money was not the only thing that made a person valuable. He said that his daughter dreamed of becoming an engineer, and he would work every job available to make sure she had the chance to try. Then, with a voice far calmer than anyone expected, he said, "So if you want to mock me, go ahead. Mock me again. I dare you." Cashin opened his mouth. Then stopped. For the first time since he entered the restaurant, the billionaire had nothing to say. Marlon turned and walked away. No one applauded. No one spoke. But several people watched him with a respect that had not been there 10 minutes earlier. What Marlon did not know was that Cashin had noticed something else. The waiter's voice had sounded strangely familiar. For the rest of the meal, Cashin barely touched his food. When Marlon returned with the bill, Cashin asked him where he had learned to speak with such confidence. Marlon simply said that life had taught him. He then explained that he used to work in construction before becoming a waiter. He had been good with machinery, good at solving problems, and had once dreamed of opening a small repair business. But after his wife died, he had needed work with flexible hours because he had no one else to care for his daughter. Cashin listened without interrupting. Then he asked the question Marlon least expected. He asked what happened to his wife. Marlon's expression softened. He said her name was Nadia, and she had always believed that people should be judged by how they treated those who could do nothing for them. She used to tell him that money could make life comfortable, but kindness was what made it meaningful. Cashin lowered his eyes. For a moment, something painful crossed his face. He remembered his own mother. Years earlier, when Cashin had been young and poor, his mother had worked as a cleaner in an office building. She had often come home exhausted, but she always told him that one day he would build a better life. Cashin had spent decades becoming wealthy because he never wanted to experience poverty again. But somewhere along the way, he had become the very kind of person his mother had warned him about. He looked at Marlon and quietly asked whether Sienna was happy. Marlon smiled for the first time. He said she was, because children could find happiness in simple things. A library book. A sunny afternoon. A sandwich cut into a funny shape. A father who came home every night. That answer stayed with Cashin long after Marlon left the table. Later that afternoon, Cashin was preparing to leave when he noticed a young girl standing outside the restaurant entrance. She was holding a school backpack and staring through the glass doors. It was Sienna. Marlon had forgotten that his daughter was being released early because of a teacher training day. She saw her father and waved. Marlon's entire face changed. The tired waiter disappeared, replaced by a father who looked genuinely happy. He rushed outside. Sienna hugged him tightly. Cashin watched through the window. Then something unexpected happened. Sienna's backpack strap broke. Books spilled across the sidewalk. Marlon immediately knelt down, gathering everything while apologizing that he would fix the strap when they got home. But Sienna smiled and told him it was okay. Cashin walked outside. He picked up one of the books. It was a mathematics workbook filled with handwritten notes and carefully solved problems. Cashin asked Sienna if she liked mathematics. She nodded enthusiastically and said she wanted to design bridges one day. Cashin looked at Marlon. The waiter looked embarrassed and said his daughter had big dreams. Cashin shook his head. He told Sienna that big dreams were not something to apologize for. Then he did something nobody expected. He handed the workbook back and asked Marlon to meet him the following morning. Marlon was suspicious. He thought perhaps Cashin wanted to complain to the manager. Instead, Cashin told him that he had once owned a small mechanical workshop before becoming an investor. He said Marlon's construction experience and mechanical knowledge could be useful to one of his companies. There was an opening for a maintenance supervisor at a new development project, with better pay, daytime hours, and benefits. Marlon stared at him. He asked why Cashin would offer him such a position after what had happened. Cashin took a long breath. He admitted that Marlon had challenged him in a way no one else dared to. More importantly, he said Marlon had reminded him of the man he used to be before wealth changed him. But Cashin had one more thing to confess. He told Marlon that his own mother had once worked as a cleaner in the same building where Cashin had started his first job. She had been mocked by wealthy clients. She had been ignored. Yet she never allowed humiliation to make her cruel. Cashin said he had spent years building an empire while forgetting the values that helped him begin. He apologized. Not as a billionaire. As a man. Marlon accepted the apology. The next morning, Marlon resigned from the restaurant. 3 months later, he was working as a maintenance supervisor at Cashin's new development project. His salary was more than double what he had earned before. For the first time in years, he could afford to take Sienna to school without rushing away immediately afterward. And Cashin changed too. He began visiting the project without his usual entourage. He learned the workers' names. He listened when they spoke. He stopped treating service workers like furniture. Eventually, he established a scholarship program for employees' children. The first scholarship recipient was Sienna. When Marlon told her, she cried. She asked whether it meant she could really become an engineer someday. Marlon hugged her and said, "You could become anything you are willing to work for." Years later, Cashin attended Sienna's university graduation. She walked across the stage wearing a graduation gown, holding her engineering degree. Marlon stood in the audience with tears streaming down his face. Cashin sat beside him. Neither man said anything. They didn't need to. One had once been a poor father carrying plates. The other had once been a powerful billionaire who had forgotten how to be human. That afternoon, both men learned the same lesson. Sometimes the person you look down on is the person who has something valuable to teach you. Marlon never became rich in the way Cashin was rich. But he became wealthy in another way. He had a daughter who believed in him. He had work that gave him dignity. And he had learned that standing up for yourself does not always mean fighting someone. Sometimes it means refusing to believe the cruel things they say about you. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to Epic Story Hub. Every interaction helps us continue creating stories about hope, kindness, courage, and second chances. And before we end, I have one special request for you. Comment, "Kindness always wins," below if you believe that a person's character is worth more than their wealth. Because in the end, Cashin didn't remember the expensive meal he ordered that afternoon. He remembered a tired father in a faded shirt who stood in front of an entire restaurant and refused to let humiliation break him. And sometimes, that's how lives change. Not through millions of dollars. Not through fame. Not through power. But through one brave moment when an ordinary person looks at the world and says, "You may not see my worth yet, but I know it myself." That day, the billionaire went silent. And the waiter finally realized that his voice had never been small.